Japan is marking the 10th anniversary of the massive earthquake and tsunami that destroyed towns and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. A minute's silence was observed across the country at 2:46 p.m. local time, the exact moment a magnitude 9 quake struck and set off the deadly wave. Emperor Naruhito and Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga led an official ceremony in Tokyo to pay tribute to some 18,000 people who lost their lives. Nearly 500,000 people were displaced, and towns around the Fukushima and Daiichi power plant remain uninhabitable. The effects of the disaster are still being felt, especially at the site of the Fukushima nuclear plant. Specialists there are still working around the clock to keep the damage in check. In a moment, we'll have more on the impact on atomic energy in the aftermath of the catastrophe in Japan. But first, a look at how events unfolded 10 years ago today.
March 11, 2011. Japan's east coast is rocked by the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in the country. Shortly afterwards, a tsunami rips through Fukushima prefecture, taking everything with it. The tsunami also cripples the Fukushima nuclear power plant, leading to explosions and meltdowns at 3 reactors.
Radioactive clouds spread over tens of kilometers around the nuclear power plant.
Thousands of people lost their lives as a result of the disaster. Tens of thousands were forced to evacuate their homes. At a press conference just 9 months later, Japan's Prime Minister at the time, Yoshihiko Noda, maintained the situation was under control. But the battle wasn't over. The Fukushima meltdown would count as the most severe nuclear accident since the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. To this day, there is still only restricted access to 1,600 square kilometers of land around the disabled Chernobyl nuclear power plant. At around 230 square kilometers, Fukushima's contamination zone is much smaller, but it will remain uninhabitable for decades to come.
And now we are 10 years ahead of the accident, and we have still 70,000 people that did not came back to their home. So, in fact, it's a human tragedy.
The Fukushima nuclear disaster continues to contaminate the air, the earth, and the groundwater to this day. Bags of radioactive contaminated soil lie scattered throughout the province. It's still unclear whether waste should be stored in the long term. The city of Tokyo was saved by a stroke of luck. Wind pushed the radioactive cloud away from the city and out to sea.
We had previous release of anthropogenic radioactivity in the ocean in the past, but not at these levels.
Shortly after the catastrophe, radiation levels in a large number of marine animals measured much higher than the limit values considered safe in Japan. Today, those levels are down significantly. But the fishing industry in Japan is only recovering slowly. In order to keep fuel cores in the reactors from melting, tons of water are used each day to cool them. Over 1 million tons of contaminated water from the cooling pipes is stored in hundreds of tanks near the power plant. But because storage space is limited and the tanks will soon reach capacity, the Japanese government is considering discharging the contaminated water into the sea in 2022.
We do not expect any harm for human or for the ecosystems. That's our point of view. I would say it's a problem of image. That's the main point for me.
Residents, fishermen, and environmentalists say that plan offers no solution to an ongoing disaster.
Let's get some perspective on this story now with Alex Rosen. He's done extensive research on the Fukushima disaster, and he's with the organization International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He's vice president of the German affiliate. Alex, how has this disaster affected the nuclear industry in Japan and worldwide?
Well, the nuclear industry took quite a hit because for the first time it became clear that this possibility of nuclear meltdowns is not something that could be attributed just to the Soviet Union in the 80s, that even in a modern state, a very modern technological state like Japan, this was possible. And this led to many countries, including my country, Germany, to phase out of nuclear energy.
Okay, so that was the immediate impact. What do you think the lessons are that we have learned from this disaster?
Well, the lessons that countries like Germany have learned is that this danger cannot be contained and it's not worth having these nuclear power plants around. The lesson that Japan has learned is apparently not as clear if you look at the fact that they are now talking about discharging radioactive water into the Pacific, that they're talking about burning radioactive soil, and that they are organizing a bizarre Olympia show in the middle of the radioactive zone in Fukushima.
But why do you think that is? I mean, why is nuclear power still in use in a place like Japan?
In the end, it's not an issue of health or science. In the end, it's an issue of power and of money. There's a very influential nuclear industry in Japan, the nuclear village, which still yields a very high influence on government. And you can see that they're calling in the International Atomic Energy Agency to run the scientific examinations on children's thyroids. So obviously, there's still, until this day, a lot of collusion, just what the Japanese parliament criticized in 2012 in its report on the Fukushima disaster, where it called it an entirely man-made disaster made in Japan.
But proponents of nuclear power say that we actually need this energy to be able to achieve climate goals globally. So what's your answer to that?
This is entirely false, and I think it's very clear that nuclear power cannot achieve the goals in the 21st century that we need to combat climate catastrophe. Countries that invest in nuclear energy right now are doing this solely to support their military nuclear industry or to keep an option for a military nuclear industry open.
Alex, what is your biggest message to governments around the world right now of what we need to have learned from Fukushima and why nuclear energy is not the solution going forward?
I think the take-home message is that in no country on Earth is this technology entirely safe, and the dangers are just too big. The metropolitan area of Tokyo was spared from nuclear destruction and contamination just by a stroke of luck. If the wind had blown differently, that would have been the end of an inhabitable Tokyo. And this danger is too big for any country to really dare put nuclear power plants in their countries.
Alex Rosen from the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Thank you very much for joining us here on DW.
Yep.
Now, the accident sent ripples all over the world. In Germany, it led to a decision to phase out nuclear power. Elsewhere, however, the appetite for atomic energy has increased over the last years. When it comes to nuclear reactor, the United States is leading the way. U.S. President Joe Biden sees atomic power as a key strategy in fighting climate change. France is number 2. The government there wants to modernize older plants. Next on the list are China and Russia. And even in Japan, where the consequences of the disaster are still painfully apparent, nuclear power appears to be there to stay. Now, for more on this, let's bring in Claudia Kempfert. She heads the Energy, Transportation and Environment Department at the German Institute for Economic Research here in Berlin, and correspondent Sonja Blaschke. She joins us from Tokyo. Sonja, let me start with you. It has been a day of mourning in Japan. Tell us more on how the country has been commemorating this crucial day.
Well, during the day, a lot of people went to the seaside. They brought flowers. They put their hands together in prayer. And I mean, it's been a very tough and a very emotional day for many people, I think. And yeah, it's not ending here. Also because of the nuclear plant, especially the people affected there. For them, this will be a much longer story.
Claudia, here in Berlin, as we heard, the Fukushima disaster has led to the government's decision to phase out nuclear power. Tell us on what that has meant to Europe's biggest economy.
Well, it meant that we now have a concrete deadline. So in the next 2 years, the last still in place nuclear power plants will be shut down. And Germany has increased the share of renewable energy drastically and substituted nuclear power. But we have time now to decommission the power plants, but also the nuclear waste issue is not solved, which will take us for the next 1,000 years to deal with. So the nuclear chapter is not closed, but for the energy production, the chapter is closed.
Now, earlier I spoke to an advisor to former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, and he said nuclear power will remain crucial for Japan. Let's listen in here for a second.
Japanese energy could not go green without using the nuclear power. Japanese terrain, Japanese geographic uniqueness makes it a little bit hard compared to other countries which have large plain flat lands to have solar power, wind power, and so on. So thermal power may be one source of energy, but at any rate, but the bottom line is you have to take advantage of the nuclear power plant with maximum safety reassured.
That was the former advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister Tomohiko Taniguchi speaking there. Claudia, Japan wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. Are goals like that only achievable by using nuclear power?
No, it's achievable with 100% renewable energy, and I'm really sad to hear that Japan still is relying on nuclear power, because nuclear power is not safe. We have seen that. It's still an earthquake region. The costs are extraordinarily high, and to construct new power plants, it's extremely costly, and it's much cheaper to increase the share of renewable energy. And Japan has the best circumstances, also the geopolitical or the geological base is there also for wind, for solar, for geothermal, for energy saving. And Japan should stick to the strategy to increase the share towards 100% renewable energy.
Sonia, over to you in Tokyo. The Japanese government wants to continue using nuclear power. What do the people there make of that 10 years after the Fukushima disaster?
Well, the majority of the population is very much against nuclear power. There's been a change over time, I would say. In the beginning, people were a little bit unsure. Can we actually manage without nuclear power? Won't there be too many blackouts or issues that would hamper the industrial production and so on? But Japan has actually done fine. I mean, there were no blackouts. Japan has substituted, of course, and imported a lot of LNG and so on. But still, even without nuclear power, with very little nuclear power, it's done well, and I think that has changed people's opinion further. And according to surveys, around 70–75% of the Japanese are actually against nuclear power, and they would like to see it end.
Sonia, power prices in Japan have recently been soaring amid cold temperatures and the shortage of liquid natural gas. How much of an issue is energy security for the country?
Of course, the industry needs the energy, that's clear, and they've been a very loud lobby, so to speak, over the years to make sure that there will be enough and so on. But like I said, there have not been any issues in the past years. And on the other hand, Japan has increased its capabilities with regard to solar power and wind power. There is much more now when it comes to green power compared to 10 years ago. So, and also the next thing is hydrogen. The Japanese government is very much promoting hydrogen these days.
And Claudia, back to you in Berlin. Give us your projection. What sort of role will nuclear energy play in the coming years?
The role will strongly decrease simply because of cost, simply because of security issue or safety reasons, and renewable energy are much cheaper right now. And this is why the end of nuclear power is ongoing, even if there will be some construction of some new power plants, but right now the share is already decreasing because we have very old power plants over the globe, and the share will not increase.
Energy expert Claudia Kempfert in Berlin and correspondent Sonia Blaschke in Tokyo. Thanks to you both.